The Limit by Frank Richardson Pierce. The engineer glanced across the cab at the old man who was talking to the fireman. It struck him the old man was really beginning to look old. The struggle of the past few years to keep his mills and logging camps running had taken a tremendous toll. The old man was jittery and looked as if he was about to go to pieces. The engineer sighed heavily and applied the air. The train, with its burden of fir logs, slackened speed. The brakes screamed in protest, echoing against the canyon walls. Right at the beginning, the engineer reflected. The old man said he'd keep the camps running part of the time, even if he took a loss. He claimed it was bad for men and equipment to be idle. It looks as if he'd paid the freight for all of us. The old man's long, strong legs were spread apart, bracing himself against the sway of the cab. "As soon as I can get the money," he said to the fireman, "I'm going to have this roadbed fixed. Things look better. A few trainloads of logs like this one will give us a breathing spell." "Yes, Mr. Herrick," the fireman said. The engineer looked at the strong, weathered face shaded by a rain-stained hat. It was thin and drawn now. The old man's arms were thinner. Even his big, scarred hands looked thin. And this is only the beginning of his fight, the engineer thought. The competition is going to be fierce. It'll take all of the old man's fight, all his shrewdness and practical experience to pull out ahead of the others. He should have kept his camps down and saved money. He'd have been in better shape. The old man's too soft-hearted to be a logger. Mike Herrick stopped talking to the fireman and walked over to the engineer. "I know what you're thinking, Jim," he said. "You'd make a lousy poker player." "You need a rest," the engineer said. "Don't worry, I'll get it. When the bird season opens, I'm going over to Roy Gilbert's place at Teaton and shoot a few Chinese pheasants and Hungarian partridges. If I'm in good shooting trim, I'll get the limit. When I come back, I'll be good for another year in harness. I've always got the limit." "Say, what's the matter, Jim?" The roar of the train increased. Flanges screamed as the locomotive lurched around a curve. "She's getting away from me," the engineer yelled. "Jump, Mike!" Mike Herrick turned to the fireman. "Jump! That's an order!" The fireman dived headlong into a thicket of salmonberry bush. The old man's eyes narrowed as he judged the speed, the grade and weight of the train. "Jump, Jim!" he yelled. "You can't hold her!" "I might," the engineer shouted. "At least I can pick a likely spot for the wreck, and save as many sticks as possible." He released the brakes, and the train fairly leaped ahead. The locomotive was 100 yards from the next curve when the old man jumped. Beyond that curve lay a narrow gulch filled with brush and second-growth fir. It was better to leave the rails here than further down, where logs and trucks might fall over cliffs. The old man hit a soft spot, relaxed, and rolled over and over. He looked up in time to see the locomotive and 3 cars pile into the gulch. The 4th car upended and spilled over the 3rd. Then the car opposite the old man reared high and fell over. Mike Herrick raced desperately up the slope to get away from the flying logs. A vine tripped him. He rolled over on his back and looked up. Even as he looked, a log struck end on. 10 feet away, it crashed down the slope, then rolled toward the old man. He struggled desperately to get clear, but the brush retarded his movements. "No use," he gasped. "It's going to get me. If it'll just miss my stomach and—" A mighty force slammed him to the earth. He shook his head to fight off the descending blackness. Then he knew no more. Slowly he opened his eyes. The bruised engineer had passed lines around the log to keep it from rolling again. It was gently digging the earth away from the old man's right leg. He was sobbing as he worked. "Mike, I'm sorry. She got away from me. Mike, I've killed you." "No, Jim," the old man gasped. "You haven't killed me. I'll live to be hanged. Yet, it wasn't your fault. I haven't had the money to spend on equipment. I sent the fireman to a Forest Service telephone. We should have a speeder here in an hour, if everybody hurries," the engineer said. Everybody did hurry. 3/4 of an hour later, 4 stretcher bearers carried the old man down to a gasoline speeder on the track below. "Keep things going, boys, until I get back," the old man gasped. "Sure we will," the solemn group of loggers promised. They avoided looking at the old man's leg. It was a pretty terrible sight, and it was wide and flat. They would only think of something that had come from under a rolling pin. They gave the old man something to ease the pain, and the next thing he knew, he was in the hospital and the doctor was bending over him. "Is she pretty bad, Doc?" the old man asked. "They gave you quite a squeeze." "Mr. Herrick," the doctor admitted, "we'll fix it up the best we can." "Don't take it off, Doc," the old man pleaded, catching something in the doctor's eye. "You can't take it off. Because... He groped for effective words, but they were slow in coming. The drug they had given him to ease the pain made him drowsy. "Get me in shape for the hunting, over at Roy Gilbert's place, Doc. I can't miss that. I always get the limit. It bucks me up so I can hold my own with the timber wolves, hereabouts. He slipped into unconsciousness, and 10 minutes later they wheeled him into the operating room. The old man's family was traveling in Europe, so lanky Ed Dravis, whom the old man had sort of adopted, hurried to the hospital. Ed was the woods boss, and when the old man retired, which Ed hoped would be some time after he was 100 years old, he would run the outfit. He paced the floor and smoked a lot of cigarettes, then followed the stretcher when they brought the old man down. He hovered outside the door and listened to the bustle within. After a while, the extra nurses and stretcher came out, and the nurse in charge said, "You can come in now, Mr. Dravis." The old man looked pretty bad, and there were strange noises coming from his throat. The room was heavy with the odor of anesthetic. "Will he live?" Ed Dravis asked huskily. "Yes, unless complications develop," the nurse answered. "He's got to live," Ed Dravis insisted. "His camp is full of old fellows like Jim, the engineer, old fellows with families, old-timers that are practically pensioners. If he dies, a new outfit will come in and take over things. The old boys will all go on the skid road." "I understand," the nurse said, sympathetically. "He's got to do more than live. He's got to hang on to the grip until he takes the company out of the woods. He's done it before, when times were bad. He's the only one who can do it now," Ed Dravis explained. "The rest of us haven't finished our training under him yet." "Shh," the nurse warned. "He's coming out of it." The old man's lips moved. He half smiled. "Many birds this year, Roy? Here's a little something I brought along. The seal isn't even broken yet. We'll go into the house and have a snort." He chuckled. He was hunting again. Ed Dravis took a big breath. "We have to go bird shooting with a bunch of men and some good dogs to understand that talk," he said. "Men have a lot of fun. The best dog these parts have ever seen, Roy, is your old setter lady," the old man said. "Shooting over her on a crisp morning added years to my life. Remember that triple I got?" He laughed again. "I sure fooled those old chink roosters. They went 3 ways, but I got 'em. And lady, remembering it, figured I was a man worth stringing with." He opened his eyes and closed them again and was silent for several minutes. "Nothing prettier than a black and white setter bounding over a green field of alfalfa. Hold on, lady's on a point. You better hit that bird when she's put him up, brother, or she'll quit you cold." He muttered for several seconds. "You hang your birds in the cellar where it's cold, son. Got the limit, eh? Well, I beat you to it. I had mine before 9 o'clock this morning. I'm going to sit here on the back steps and razz Roy and the others when they come in." He opened his eyes and stared hard. "Oh, yes," he said slowly. "I remember now. The train. Piled up. Hello, Ed. Good old Ed. Always on hand. In a pinch. Let's see. My leg was smashed. He shook his head and his voice grew demanding with a trace of hysteria. "Did they take it off, Ed? Is my leg gone? Can't I hunt any more?" Now, the nurse whispered. She touched his forehead with her cool hand. He relaxed a moment. Then, with surprising strength, he tossed the bed covering aside. Then he stared. The old man stared a long time. He set his jaws tight and closed his eyes. "So they took it off. That damn doctor took it off. It's the end of old man Herrick." "Easy, Mr. Herrick," Ed Dravis pleaded in a choking voice. "It had to be done. You'd have died. Better off dead," the old man muttered. Can't hunt, can't stand up to another man and fight, can't do a million things. Listen, you've got to listen, Ed said almost sharply. You could lose both legs and still lick most logging operators to a frazzle. And you're going hunting, too. You'll be right out among them when the time comes, and you'll be sitting on Roy Gilbert's back porch with the limit when the others come in. No, the old man said slowly. I'll never go hunting again. No dog with the smell of birds in its nostrils and its blood running hot will wait for a one-legged man. He sighed heavily, the sign of a brave fighter confessing defeat for the first time in his life. The nurse gave him something to quiet his nerves, and Ed Travis sat down to be on hand if he was needed. In the days that followed, Ed Travis spent a lot of time with the old man. He gave verbal reports of what was transpiring at the different camps and told him the latest yarns he had heard across cigar counters. The wreck had been cleared up, the damage repaired, and Jim was at the throttle again, bringing in trainloads of logs. The market wasn't very good, but Ed skipped that. When the old man was ready to go home, Ed brought him a wheelchair and sent it to the big house which was home, as well as general headquarters. The old man had built the house 30 years ago. It was located on a bluff overlooking a crescent bay. Behind loomed the great forest, and still beyond the towering Olympic Mountains. From his front porch he could see ships outbound, many of them carrying lumber manufacturers from his logs. When he was well enough, they wheeled him to the porch. But he just stared, without seeing the ships, nor hearing the rumble of logging trucks, as Jim brought a string of them down to the boom pond. As the weeks passed, Ed and Jim grew anxious. They talked things over a lot, then consulted the doctor. He's lost his fighting heart, Ed glumly admitted. Things that used to make him roll up his sleeves and roar leave him untouched. The long fight to pull his logging company through the depression broke him down. The loss of the leg finished him, the doctor explained. We know he's no quitter. It's his inability to get going again that's licking him. He eyed them sharply. How are things going with the company? Not any too well, Travis confessed. He used to find the shortcuts that brought down operating costs. Now, he shrugged his shoulders. I'm basing a lot of hope on the hunting season, the doctor said at last. If we can get him over the mountains to Gilbert's ranch, he may get hold of himself. He'll never go, Ed declared. I know the old man, Jim added. He'll stiffen his neck and won't go. He's got to go, the doctor declared. Get rough with him if you have to. Ed shook his head. I couldn't get rough with him, he said. You can't kick a man when he's down. Ed Travis went to the old man's gun cabinet and got out his pet weapon, the 20-gauge. He brought it out and placed it across his knees. You'd better clean it, he advised. Hunting season opened Saturday morning, and the expression in the old man's eyes silenced him. I never thought you were downright cruel, Ed, he said. You know I can't do it. A man on crutches. I've been sitting here thinking about it for days. Early breakfast, the sun tinting the sky, the chinks calling at each other from buttes. Then he buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Clean that gun, Ed ordered, and do it now. The old man turned the weapon over in his hands a couple of times, then squinted through the bore. Slowly he began cleaning it. I guess I'll have to go through hell to show him it can't be done, he said. Maybe when he'd glumly broken his heart wide open for them to see, maybe then they'd be convinced that the old man wasn't going to shoot birds anymore. Ever. He said little when Ed drove him across the mountains several days later. He sniffed the bracing air and gazed at the apple orchards and golden fields of eastern Washington. Men moved across the fields, following dogs that frequently pointed. Chink roosters took off with defiant cackles and hunted cover. All this was training for the open day. Chinks are thick now, but watch 'em take to the orchards. Right after the first guns let go, the old man said. He glanced at his outfit. It was the first time he hadn't brought a dog along. Why disappoint a dog, he muttered. Roy Gilbert was waiting when Ed drove into the yard. Hell, you old tramp, he said. I see you brought that 20-gauge pop gun along. Me, I prefer old meat-getter here. He patted the worn barrel of a 12-gauge pump gun. He ignored the old man's crutches and acted as if he didn't see the old man's missing leg. There's a bottle in my overcoat pocket, Roy, the old man said. The seal isn't broken yet. We'll drink to the destruction of our enemies. Sure, Roy said, but first let's settle one thing so it won't hang over our heads, the old man said grimly. I came over against my better judgment. A one-legged man hasn't any business shooting birds. It isn't fair to a good dog, and I've always treated my dog square. Watch this, Ed." He called the dog and started towards the nearest alfalfa field. The dog began quartering the field, leaping up and down, its silken ears floating with each bound. It was a blood-stirring picture. Suddenly the dog came to a point. The old man swung along on his crutches as fast as he could, but the nervous bird broke from cover before he could have approached within range. He repeated the performance again and again until the puzzled dog turned and trotted back to the house in disgust. "There, Ed," the old man said simply. "I told you it wasn't any use for me to try it." "This isn't the dog we got for you, Mike," Roy said. "Whether you like it or not, you're going to be routed out in the morning. Now let's have that drink. Instead of drinking to the destruction of our enemies, let's make it a long and happy life to the first man who brings in the limit tomorrow morning." "I'll drink to that," the old man quickly agreed. It was dark when Roy called him. The old man dressed, got his crutches under his arms, and swung into the kitchen. A half-dozen men in hunting clothes were standing around the stove, drinking coffee. Dogs chained up outside whined impatiently. The old man eyed proceedings dully. His heart was heavy and bitter. He was beginning to hate Ed Dravis for forcing him to go through this torture. Roy Gilbert set down his empty coffee cup. Then he suggested territory for various members of the party to cover. "There's a box of apples for the man who gets the limit," he said. "Mike, you better take the alfalfa patch. That's your favorite spot. It's where you got the triple that time. Your dog's tied up to the wood shed. Her name's Sally. She's a Gordon setter." They hurried off, leaving the old man alone. In the distance he heard crump, crump. "Some bird got both barrels," he said. "I'll bet it was a miss. The whir of wings excites us city slickers, and we shoot too soon." He eased himself down the back steps and got a firm grip on his crutches. He carried the light gun clutched against his left crutch. Sally whimpered eagerly as he came up. She acted as if she were afraid she would be left out of the fun. "They treated you rotten, girl," he said, "but never mind. I'll be out of here tonight, and tomorrow you can go hunting with a fellow who has both." He stopped suddenly and stared. "Why, girl," he blurted, "why—" He saw the dog had lost one of her hind feet. It was off at the ankle. He unsnapped the chain, and the dog bounded around him in circles, frantic with delight. Then she let off. She saw the other dogs in the distance, started for them. Then, as if remembering her handicap, she stopped and looked back at the man. The old man waved his hands toward the alfalfa patch, and she plunged into it. Her refusal to quit because she lacked 4 feet shamed him. He swore at himself as he swung across the field. She worked close and thoroughly. There had been birds in the field, but they had left. To the right, the old man heard Ed Dravis's weapon crack. Roy Gilbert's voice came faintly. "You got him. There goes another up behind you." Ed shot twice and missed. Gilbert's laugh came over the field. The old man looked around. The sun was just over the eastern rim of the mountains. On every hand there were orchards, laden with apples, fields of golden stubble or alfalfa. The air was crisp, heady. It was this that had revitalized him year after year, and he was here again. He felt the spell of the place claim him, as it always had, stirring new response in his blood. Sally came to a sudden point. The old man hurried up as swiftly as possible, got set, swung his gun to his shoulder, and said, "Put 'em up, girl." A wary old rooster, cackling angrily, vaulted into the air, and the old man shot. The rooster disappeared into the nearest orchard. "I'm a damned city slicker," the old man growled. "I shot too soon." Sally looked over her shoulder, surprised. She started into a new area, turned almost in midair, and came to a point. In her excitement, she tried to lift one of her front feet off the ground to make the point perfect, but lost her balance. "You can't do it with 3 legs, girl," the old man said. He swung desperately towards the spot. She waited patiently. Guns cracked on every hand as dogs put up the birds. Sally held, her body shaking with excitement. "Hop to it, Sally," the old man panted as he came up. 2 roosters fairly exploded into the air a few yards ahead. He knocked one crutch aside and balanced with the other. His 20 gauge swung to the right and cracked. Then it swept the air to the left and cracked out again. The roosters dived swiftly to the ground, spinning and plummeting. "A double," he yelled. "Wait." Here's one coming 1,000,000 miles an hour. A regular grandfather of a rooster rushed towards him. He reloaded, ducked as the bird passed overhead, then turned and fired. The rooster went end over end. The old man dropped his gun, picked up his other crutch, and swung towards the spot. He picked up the bird, and as he stuffed it into his pocket, Sally came up with another. He rubbed her head, and she bounded away to locate the third. "Bring it along," he shouted. "I saw a covey of Huns settled in that stubble." The old man was halfway there when Sally came up with the other bird. He accepted it and sent her on. "3 chinks and 5 Huns is the limit," he muttered, "and we've got the 3 chinks. Say, maybe we'll get the limit yet." We got 2 out of the covey, a single out of the next, and a double from the third covey Sally put up. "Come on," he said. "If we hang around here any longer, the game warden will be looking for us, and tomorrow's another day." He found himself chuckling deep down inside of him. Full, rich, light-hearted satisfaction burbling to expression. A half-hour later he swung down into the cellar. It was cool, earthy, and there were boxes of apples stacked about. He reached up and from long experience located the nail in which he always hung his birds. It was still there. He was a little grayer, the spike carried more rust, but in this hour neither was bent. The old man found a place in the sun and sat down. Sally came up, circled, and lay down near his feet. He tried to remain calm, but it was difficult. He had been first to bring in the limit, and he was entitled to gloat. They came in at last, with bulging pockets and burr-covered pants. "I heard you shooting," Ned Travis said uneasily. "What luck?" "The limit," the old man said. "I'm coming back next year with a leg. The crutch is getting in the way. I missed my first bird cleaner than a whistle. I thought Sally might quit me cold, but she only shook her head and put another bunch. Say, where'd you get her, anyway, Roy?" They couldn't help hearing the jubilation in his voice. Ed looked at Roy and nodded, smiling a little to himself with a sort of secret satisfaction. "Ed here got worried about you," Roy answered. "Said you was losing your fight. He thought if we could find a dog that had lost its leg yet refused to let that handicap it, that you might be ashamed into showing a little fight," the old man cut in. Roy half nodded. "So I searched all over the country and finally found Sally. She'd stepped into a hay cutter, but her breed wouldn't let a little thing like that bother her. He might have told of the hours he put in, swinging along on crutches and teaching Sally to hunt in close, but he didn't. He only went down into the cellar, got a box of apples, and putting them into the old man's car, said, 'We better eat. We're all half-starved.' 'I'd like to buy the dog,' the old man said. 'I'll pay any price.' There wasn't anything he wouldn't give to own that dog. They belonged together, no doubt about it. No doubt about that. 'I'm afraid she isn't for sale. She's yours already, Mike,' Roy said. She must have been yours from the minute she stepped into that hay cutter." I wouldn't be surprised," the old man said, and Ed noticed there was a gleam in his eyes. He wasn't sure whether the gleam came from tears or whether it was the light that meant that the old man had found himself and all was well. Perhaps it was a little of each. The end.